presentation. So I'd like to introduce the speakers, Linda and Sara Kelemen. Linda is a social and community psychologist who has decades of experience working with communities, especially with people of color, on issues that focus on well-being in the largest sense, the health and well-being of people, of communities, and of the environment. She's also a senior fellow in the Mitchell Center, and she is centrally involved in everything we do, and boy, am I grateful for that. Sara, on the other hand, is at the other end of the professional development spectrum. She just began grad school at UMaine this fall. In fact, she's working with Rachel Chapman, who, if you had the good fortune a while back to hear her give a talk in this series, Rachel is an assistant professor of sustainable agriculture at the UMaine Agroecology Lab, and Sara's very involved in that program. But this talk and this work is a little bit falls under the heading, How I Spent My Summer Vacation. We recruited Sara to work on this project in response to a request from the Climate Council and the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. I'll let Sara and Linda explain that, but a very important assessment of equity, diversity, inclusion, and justice issues, as they will explain. About a month ago, Sara was invited to discuss the equity assessment with the Maine Climate Council. She wasn't the first speaker in that presentation, however. She had to follow Dr. Nirav Shah and Ambassador Molly and Dana. If you've ever heard them speak, you know that those are hard acts to follow, but I can assure you that she met their high standards of compelling communication. And Linda and I tried to total up the number of centuries we've been working in universities, and although we couldn't come up with the exact figure, we consider Sara to be one of the best students we've ever worked with. So I'm going to turn it over to them. The title of their talk, Maine Can Lead in Fair Planning for Addressing Climate Change, Steps in an Equity Assessment.
David, thank you for that wonderful introduction that just captures why you're so much fun to work with. And everyone, we're delighted to have this opportunity today to talk about something that is just so important. It's so important to Maine. It's so important to all of us. And it's really about, well, climate change and how we're thinking about it. But as we plan to address this important problem, how do we make sure that fairness is central to what we're doing and what we're planning? So many of you that are on this webinar of sorts are people who are doing things in this area, and so many others of you are people who are ready to do things, and this is an opportunity for you to start to think about what you would like to do. And I want to just reiterate what David said about Sara. Sara, you're fun to work with. This has been great. And Sara's going to get us started in terms of taking us through sort of how we got started doing this, how we were asked, and what we did. And there's 112 pages, our report. Good sleeping material, but also good things for you to read. And so we're just trying to kind of hit the high points, and there'll be time at the end. I'll be collecting questions that you put, in the chat, and we'll follow up. But Sara, does that get you started? Is that good? So go for it.
All right. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm really excited to be able to spend this time with all of you. And also I would like to say big thank you to David and Linda. It was an absolute pleasure working with them this summer. And I'm really excited that I get to be here with both of them today. So we're going to get started. Today we are talking about assessing the equity of Maine's climate action plan. So first off, I just want to give you a little timeline of events so you can understand kind of where we became involved, how we became involved, and what the Maine Climate Council is, if you're not familiar with that. So on June 26, 2019, the governor and the legislature created the Maine Climate Council, which is an assembly of scientists, industry leaders, bipartisan local and state officials, and engaged citizens to develop a 4-year plan to put Maine on a trajectory to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. So by executive order of Governor Mills, the state must also achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. Working groups were formed to tackle the project. So the 6 working groups were transportation, buildings, housing and infrastructure, energy, coastal and marine, natural and working lands, community resilience planning, public health, and emergency management. And if that sounds like more than 6 to you, you're thinking the right way. Each one of these groups was given a really large amount of information to tackle, and they did a really wonderful job thinking very deeply about prospective strategies for Maine. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't include the fact that they were all volunteers, and they volunteered their time over the course of a year to develop these really wonderful strategies for Maine. So, as I said, over the course of the year from June 2019 to June 2020, the 6 working groups met to develop strategies. They met regularly, and the strategies were to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote adaptive capacity to the effects of climate change to be more resilient as a state. So if that mitigation adaptation language is a little bit unfamiliar, that's okay. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And all of the definitions are in our report, which is available on the Maine Climate Council's website, if you'd like to take a look at that. So over the course of the year, as the working groups were meeting, they came up with a total of 40 potential strategies and additional sub-strategies to address mitigation and adaptation. In June 2020, the working groups presented their draft strategies to the Climate Council. And over the summer, a cost-benefit analysis and an equity assessment of the strategies took place. We're going to talk about the equity assessment today, since that's what we were working on. But if you're interested in the cost-benefit analysis, it's great, and that is also available on the Climate Council's website. During the course of the summer, we worked on creating an assessment framework that could be applied to the strategies presented by each working group so that we could better understand and report back to the Climate Council the potential equity impacts that we could foresee. This work culminated in a presentation of our report back to the Maine Climate Council in early September. On December 1st of this year, the Climate Action Plan is due to the legislature and the governor's office. The contents of this plan will guide statewide policy as well as state assistance on a municipal level. This deadline is far from the end of the road, though. This plan is iterative and will be updated every 4 years. So if you would like more information about the Maine Climate Council, or to download our report or the cost-benefit analysis, you can visit maineclimatecouncil.gov. And there's a lot of really great information on there. You can also access all of the draft strategies created by all 6 of the working groups. So if you're interested in delving more deeply, that's where you should go. So I just want to take some time to do some key term definition here, because we use a lot of these terms often in our report, and it's pretty essential to be on the same page about what we are talking about. So first of all, vulnerability and frontline communities. The term vulnerable is not meant to imply a general sense of victimhood. Rather, it is used here to discuss the ways in which historic and systemic discrimination, exploitation, and underrepresentation have left some residents of Maine more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than others. Vulnerable populations are frontline communities when it comes to climate change. This means that due to systemic oppression and injustice, they will experience the first and worst effects of a changing climate. Environmental justice, climate justice, and energy justice. What do they all mean? So, environmental justice has primarily focused on the ways in which people of color and poor people unequally are exposed to environmental harms, and has probed the roots of inequality, asking why those who have already been subject to disadvantage are also exposed to environmental harms. In the last 2 decades, this line of thinking has given rise to the climate justice movement, which stresses the ways in which the effects of climate change might further entrench unequal power structures and creating increased oppression and disenfranchisement. The energy justice movement takes this thinking one step further, suggesting that a clean energy economy is not necessarily a just one, and focuses on the inequalities in the energy system that may persist or worsen when sustainable energy becomes a political priority. We utilize this collective knowledge to focus on areas where the working group's proposed strategies could be strengthened to promote justice and equality for Maine's most vulnerable populations. The broad category of justice is helpfully broken down into 4 categories by scholars who study justice and energy transitions. First is distributional justice, which refers to the distribution of benefits and burdens across populations. Second is procedural justice, which focuses on who is included in energy decision-making processes and seeks to ensure that energy procedures are fair, equitable, and inclusive for all who choose to participate. Third is recognition justice, which requires an understanding of historic and ongoing inequalities and prescribes efforts that seek to reconcile those inequalities. And fourth is restorative justice, which means using government or other intervention to avoid distributional, recognitional, or procedural justices or to correct them. And finally, equity. Why do we use equity instead of equality? We use it here to acknowledge that equal distribution of resources is not sufficient. Instead, equity takes into account the fact that systems of oppression keep certain people from accessing resources, and an equitable system seeks to provide increased resources to marginalized and disadvantaged communities. The risks and effects of climate change disproportionately fall upon people of color and low-income populations. It is, therefore, absolutely critical that policies intended to mitigate climate change or increase adaptive capacity to its impacts do not exacerbate existing burdens and, wherever possible, increase well-being and address the root causes of inequality. So I want to think a little bit specifically about Maine. So in Maine, the average annual temperature has increased 3.2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1890, and the rate of warming has increased most notably since 1960. The 6 warmest years on records have occurred since 1998. Again, Maine here, we're plotting precipitation over time. Annual precipitation has increased 15% since 1895, and the increase has come from more rain and less snow. As with temperature, the rate of increase has accelerated in recent decades. And the reason why I'm showing you these is a reminder that the changes in Maine are changes that people are going to have to adapt to. And the effects of these changes are not necessarily going to be equally distributed. Who has to deal more with the effects of hot days? Who has to deal more with the effects of flooding? It's often frontline communities. And I also wanted to show this to you to remind you that the reason why we have a climate action plan is to curb the emissions that are causing climate change. And these shifts will require changes in the way we live and work and move. And all of these changes that we make as a state will have benefits and burdens to be distributed either equitably or not. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about Maine specifically. In Maine, 61.3% of the population lives in a rural area, which is the highest percent in the nation, higher even than Alaska with 33.9%. The poverty rate in rural Maine is 13.7%, compared with 10.2% in urban areas of the state. What you can see on the map here is the energy burden, which is the percent of income used to pay for household energy costs. Maine has high energy burdens due to climate, prevalence of older housing stock. A high percentage of people live in energy poverty in Maine, which is generally defined as spending over 10% of your income on energy costs. And finally, due to the fact that much of Maine is so rural, a lot of people in Maine drive often, making transportation responsible for 54% of Maine's greenhouse gas emissions, which is really uncommon. And of that 54%, 59% is from light duty passenger cars and trucks, showing that, again, a lot of this is coming from individual people accessing resources within the state. So here we have, this shows which parts of Maine are the most rural. And then over here, this is how old the houses are. So you can see that Maine does have a lot of older houses and a lot of people living in rural areas. Older housing stock tends to be much less energy efficient than newer housing stock. A 2018 study by the Maine Office of the Public Advocate found that more than 50% of low-income houses had insufficient wall insulation, one of the highest rates in the country. The cost of heating and cooling for low-income households is also 3 times more expensive than households at other income levels, as reported by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy. In the report, they say that lower incomes, less efficient housing, and limited access to energy efficiency programs can explain the higher energy burdens faced by these groups. And they found that even though these families paid less overall for their energy bills, they paid more per square foot, indicating the relative inefficiency of these homes. So this map here, I just wanted to kind of situate Maine within the broader context of the country. On this map, you can see the percent of income spent on energy bills in homes making below 50% of the federal poverty level. As you can see, Maine, North Dakota, and Alabama all have low-income people paying the highest percentages of their income on energy. In Maine, this is due to the overlapping effects of rurality, old housing stock, and poverty. Those below 50% of the federal poverty level are spending between 49.8% of their income in Androscoggin County right here, and 61.8% of their income in Somerset County on energy. So if you'll remember the slide I showed you before, showing the energy burden across Maine with the average being around 6%, think again about that and think about the difference between spending 6% of your income on energy and 61% of your income on energy. And the reason why I'm showing you this is to get at the compounding effects of climate change, energy policy, rurality, and poverty. Those who already struggle with poverty end up using more energy due to inefficiencies in their homes, paying more of their income on energy, and remaining unable to upgrade to energy efficient technology. So I hope that this will get you all kind of into the mindset where you can see that perhaps, as I'm going to suggest later, incentive payments and subsidies are not sufficient for making change, and instead the focus should be more holistic. In this case, this means focusing on the causes of rural poverty in Maine, and in other cases, a different focus. So just to stress this again, when we talk about climate and energy justice in Maine, we're talking about addressing the root causes of inequality as a way to lift up the most vulnerable. This means addressing systemic racism and focusing on the lack of resources available to frontline communities in Maine. In April of 2020, the Mitchell Center received a request from the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future to develop a framework that could be used to enhance the equity outcomes of Maine Climate Council's work. Following meetings with the staff at the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future, we began by gathering information on major equity assessments from other cities, towns, and states across the country. So here we have Climate Action Through Equity from Portland, Oregon, which is a companion document to Portland, Oregon's Climate Action Plan, and also has some really great examples of goal setting and measurable equity outcomes. Next, we have Boston's Preliminary Resilience Assessment, which is more about adaptive measures and really discusses participation and self-determination of frontline communities in the Boston area. Next, we have Providence's Climate Justice Plan, which is relatively new. It was published in 2019, and it is amazing. I highly recommend, if you're interested in this, go out and read it. And then we also looked at things that were more specific to Maine. So over here we have Bridging the Rural Efficiency Gap, which came from the Island Institute, which looks at energy efficiency in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Alaska, and includes some really, really wonderful case studies about energy efficiency success stories. This is also a really awesome resource that I definitely recommend. So we gathered information from across the country, focused specifically on Maine because we did want our work to be Maine specific. And then we came up with a framework that we're going to use to assess all of these different strategies. The framework that we developed was for this purpose specifically, but can also be applied to climate adaptation and mitigation strategies more broadly. Our intention was to draw upon prior work as much as possible, as I've already said. The framework is primarily based on the work of transportation equity scholars Karen Lucas and Kate Pangborn, but also builds upon ideas in documents, reports, and toolkits from many other regions. Throughout the process of creating a framework, we continue to work closely with the staff at the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the future. Once the framework was finalized, it was used to analyze each of the 40 draft strategies from the 6 working groups. Midway through this process, feedback on the emerging information was solicited from the 9-member Climate and Equity Advisory Committee, which is a group of Maine equity leaders put together by the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the future. The report was completed and submitted to the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the future and the Maine Climate Council in early September. I'm going to be pretty brief here, but I want to kind of run you through what our framework looked like. What did we come up with? What is the tool that we use to analyze all of these strategies? So for each strategy, the framework provides an opportunity to assess equity outcomes from several angles. When addressing climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies, the intended and unintentional outcomes are described as social and distributional impacts. This refers to both the risk of inequality arising due to unforeseen burdens, as well as the opportunity for positive benefits accruing as a side effect of the target policy, otherwise known as co-benefits. Social and distributional impacts can generally be broken down into 3 categories: health, wealth, and accessibility. So for each strategy, we asked, what are the impacts of this strategy on the wealth of Maine people? What are the impacts of this strategy on the health of Maine people? And finally, would this strategy impact Maine people's access to necessary services or resources? These categories are rather broad, so the next section of the framework allows us to look more specifically at potential equity impacts on groups of Maine people who will disproportionately face climate risks while having fewer resources to respond to those risks. The framework specifically considers impacts upon financially vulnerable populations, socially and demographically vulnerable populations, and geographically vulnerable populations, all frontline communities in Maine. The choice of these categories reflects similar decisions made by the Equality and Human Rights Commissions and authors of Boston's Resilient Plan and Georgetown Climate Center's Equitable Adaptation and Legal Policy Toolkit. The framework also addresses issues of participation. In situations where vulnerable populations are likely to be affected by the proposed policy, the framework asks about the extent those populations were meaningfully involved in the process of creating and/or implementing the policy. While meaningful is a subjective term, it should be clear whether the outreach in question was an afterthought, checking the box once the planning process was already well underway, or if it reflects the values and preferences of the community in question and provides them with an opportunity to disrupt unequal power dynamics and meaningfully participate in agenda setting. So now that you can kind of understand what the framework was, I'm going to show you some examples of the different types of strategies that were given to us by the working groups that we analyzed using this framework. So from buildings, housing, and infrastructure, one of the strategies that they provided to us for analysis was to improve the efficiency and resiliency of existing building envelopes. From the coastal and marine working group, we have track coastal and ocean climate impacts to support adaptive decision-making. From emergency management, we have increased engagement with community officials to raise emergency management and adaptation resilience as a priority. From the energy working group, we have institute a renewable fuel standard for all heating fuels with incentives sufficient to drive rapid reductions in emissions from heating and processed fuels used in Maine. From the natural and working lands working group, we have provide technical assistance on natural climate solutions to landowners, land managers, and agricultural producers. And from transportation, we have expand electrification of vehicles. So I know I went through that pretty fast. And again, if you want to actually read all of the strategies from the working groups, they are all available on the Maine Climate Council's website. So now that you understand both what the framework that we created was and what kinds of strategies we applied it to, I'm going to move on and talk briefly about our findings, key themes, and then I'm going to talk about some recommendations that we have. So we think that this should be the beginning of an ongoing process to address climate and energy justice in Maine. To this point, we recommend that the Maine Climate Council should create an equity working group to continue this work. Since Maine's climate action plan will be iterative, updated every 4 years, centering equity issues in Maine's ongoing work to combat and adapt to climate change is essential. Second, while Maine is a very white state, it is critical that racial justice and equity are centered in our state's conversation about climate and energy justice. Third, given the unique authorities of tribal nations, the council and the state should ensure inclusion of tribal leadership and knowledge as it considers communication, assistance, incentives, and programs for municipalities and vulnerable communities. Fourth, goal setting should be an important aspect of all climate mitigation and adaptation policies as they relate to equity. The only way to ensure measurable success and to grow from mistakes is by measuring progress. Fifth, many strategies across many working groups, but specifically buildings, infrastructure and housing, transportation, and energy, suggested the use of incentive and rebate programs as part of the policy that they recommend. The working groups were consistent in their recognition that these incentive programs must be developed in such a way that they equitably distribute resources, and we reaffirm this line of thinking. It's critical that incentive programs target and assist those in the greatest need first, lest the incentives be doled out to those who could already afford an upgrade without assistance. Following from that, we would like to emphasize that uplifting the most vulnerable people in Maine will benefit all people in Maine. It is clear from reading the strategies that members of the working groups were already aware of this point as they went to work, but it definitely bears repeating, and it is a point worth making explicit. Participation and inclusion continue to be paramount to any effort to integrate equity into Maine's climate action plan. For all policies with potential to impact vulnerable stakeholder groups, timely and meaningful engagement is an important step, not to be overlooked in the name of reaching the destination more quickly. It is never too early to ask who should be involved, how can they shape the process, and what are their barriers to involvement. Next, we'd like to give a shout out to Maine. We recognize that this climate action plan and conversation around climate and energy justice is an opportunity for Maine to be a leader. Insofar as the climate action plan creates change through the lens of equity, Maine can show that prioritizing equity can assist in the achievement of climate goals. It's important to acknowledge that climate action is not inherently just, and therefore the process of shaping climate policies will require thoughtful planning and action to ensure that Maine's future is both resilient and equitable. This graphic is from the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and is called Community Action to Ownership. And I wanted to share it as a way of thinking a little bit more deeply about what constitutes meaningful participation and how to effectively promote self-determination for frontline and vulnerable communities. So here on the scale, we have from 0, which is ignore, 1, inform, 2, consult, involve, collaborate, and defer to. And I would say that Maine right now is probably around a 3, giving voice and ensuring community needs and assets are integrated into the planning, into process and informed planning. And which means that the message they're sharing with communities is, you are making us think and therefore act differently about this issue. But there's room for improvement here. Scale it up, 4s and 5s. And I think ideally it would be great to see Maine move in that direction, where the state is both delegating power to and promoting community ownership over solutions. To wrap up our recommendations and talking about moving forward a bit more, we recommend that Maine emulate the work that has been done on a smaller scale, primarily in cities like Portland, Oregon, Providence, and Boston. Take that and do it on a big scale and become a leader in climate and energy justice. What does this look like? It looks like centering the lived experiences of people living in frontline communities. In Providence, this means a focus on empowering community organizers and using consensus building and facilitation techniques. A simple but effective example of what this looked like is, in order to understand how frontline community members understood and interacted with the fossil fuel industry in Providence, interviewers asked community members of frontline communities the following 4 questions. 1, how do you keep warm in the winter? What do you like about that, and what would you change? 2, how do you keep cool in the summer? What do you like about that, and what would you change? 3, how do you get around the city? What do you like about that, and what would you change? And 4, what in your community keeps you and or your family healthy, and what do you think makes you and your family sick? They used these answers to shape proposed solutions rather than creating solutions and then asking for community feedback. A second example, in Portland, Oregon, members of an equity advisory committee are paid for their time rather than asking already burdened people to provide their expertise for free. This type of support could increase the ability of vulnerable populations to participate in the design, implementation, and evaluation of equitable climate policies. While these examples are both from cities, we do think that they could be applied fairly easily in Maine as well. For all of these options to become available, though, the first step is to recognize and name inequity as such. All solutions stem from a recognition of the problem as one of an imbalance of power, and for frontline communities, a lack of access to the resources that are required to make change. And now I'm going to hand it over to Linda, who is going to talk a little bit about what you can do.
So weren't we right about Sara being amazing and giving us a lot of information to think about, and we're seeing people put questions in the chat and do continue to do that. So part of what we're hoping to communicate to you, part of what we're hoping that you comes through is your key. You can make a difference. This is not a problem that is going to be solved by one person or one group. It's a solvable situation, but it takes the knowledge, experience, skills of all of us to really make a difference. And we all know that Maine is so interesting. Think about how long our coast is and how many people live along the coast. So sea level rise is worrisome. Think about how many of us are involved in rural, like raising crops, various kinds of things that really depend on a kind of stable climate. And how do we think about that? There are just all kinds of interesting issues that we need to be thinking about together in order to solve this. And so what you could do is do some reading, and you might set up a club to like read Providence's Climate Justice Plan report, read some things that have been written by fellow Mainers. It could be a great way to start to get to know your neighbors, to get to know the people in your church or synagogue. Another thing that we're hoping people will think about is engage with organizations around energy and climate justice. I mean, there are some amazing people listening in, like Kathy Lee, who's asked about who are Maine equity leaders. Well, she's an example. And the advisory board we had working with us is an example. Maine Climate Table. Students, there's some wonderful new programs starting up where students are really holding all of our various feet to the fire to really start to work on this. So engage with organizations. And one of the things that I find, and maybe you do too in doing this, is when I don't know the organization, I feel odd going to them and saying, I want to be involved, especially because I feel like my information or knowledge is limited. Go anyway, let's do it together. A second way you can really make a difference is to talk with your friends about issues and opportunities. So it could be, you know, when you're out like cleaning the weeds out of your yard, trying to get rid of those leaves, doing all kinds of different things. Start to talk with your friends, start to talk with your neighbors about issues and opportunities, because that's really how we're going to make a difference. And also think about special skills you have and share them with others around climate change issues. I've been talking to people who do fishing, you know, out in the ocean, and they have amazing skills at kind of understanding changes that are going on with the ocean. And they're key people to find a way to get their voices, to get their stories into how we're thinking about things and how we're doing things. It's just a really, really important to think about, what are your skills? Your skill might be that you're good at clarifying what other people say that isn't clear. Your skill might be that you really do have to do a lot of driving for your job. And so you're really aware of what the kinds of issues are there. And you want to be able to bring together people who are thinking about that. You may be a Sunday school teacher, and you talk a lot with children, and you get to know what their interests are, and you may be able to talk to other Sunday school teachers about what could happen. So our hope is that what our talk is about and our equity audit is about is really being able to, all of us think together, it's not somebody else's problem. It's a way for us all to come together and to think about the issues, to think about what universities should be doing, to think about what city councils should be doing, to think about what people who play music that gets us excited about problems should be doing. So really thinking hard about what you can do. And we would just love to hear from you about your plan, what you would like to do. We've also, in the chat, we've been asked, has there been a response so far from the climate council about the report? And Sara, do you want to talk a little bit about the presentation? Just again, remind people what you said and what you're hearing.
So the response from the Maine Climate Council has been very positive. They were throughout the whole process of working with the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. They have been extremely responsive, extremely excited about this work, always ready for the next step, ready for the next challenge. And they also have been thinking really deeply about how they can create relationships with frontline communities that are going to be meaningful and lasting, because they definitely acknowledge that government has not always been supportive to these communities. And so gaining trust is something that they're definitely thinking about. And it's been a pleasure to work with them and watch them. You know, we were learning together all summer long. So it was really great.
Sara, one of the questions, and David, I hope you'll jump in too, in terms of some of the questions, is one of the questions is, and I'm going to reframe it a little bit after I read it, because we don't have an answer to this, but do you think electrifying vehicles is the best solution for greening transport in Maine? What about expanding public transportation? And Sara, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, sure. So one thing I will say about electric vehicles is that this may be fairly obvious, but worth saying, distribution of electric vehicles is not equitable. They're very expensive, and one of the key things about the rebate programs associated with most electric vehicle programs is that they only apply once you already buy the vehicle. So if you can't afford the upfront cost of buying the vehicle, no matter how much money it's going to save you on the back end, you can't benefit from that rebate program. And then to add to that, if there's something like a fuel tax, that disproportionately affects people who have older vehicles, have non-electric vehicles, and also people who live in rural areas who are driving more. So it's kind of a twofold problem there, where both it's hard to afford the electric vehicles, and the people that can't afford them miss the rebate, and then they end up paying more for infrastructure updates because they are the ones paying the gas tax more frequently. So electrification of vehicles is really, really important, especially because people in Maine drive a lot. But yes to public transportation. I don't know if you all are familiar with UMaine. They have a really amazing rideshare program, which obviously right now rideshare maybe is not the way to go, but that's another thing that Maine is doing that's really cool. And also one thing that we did recommend is in California, there is a rebate program for buying used electric vehicles. So that's something that I think that Maine is also maybe going to consider.
Another question is in the chat is, what are communities saying that they want or need or are skeptical of? And one of the, this isn't in the question, but one of the interesting things this raises is Maine is also very interesting because we have islands. We have towns that are closer to Canada than they are to most of the rest of the US. So what are communities saying, and how would people find out about that? Or what did we learn a little of?
Well, I would not speak for those communities, so I can't really answer that question. I think that the answer is to go out and ask them and then publicize the answers. So that's something that Providence did, which I think is really cool. They have this thing, I think it's called the Providence Climate Futures Story Series. And there are a series of prompts about what Providence might look like in the future. And people who live in Providence respond. And then those stories are all public, so you can listen to them. And I think that that's a really interesting and innovative way to publicize the viewpoints and ideas and allow for self-determination for people who live in frontline communities in Maine.
That's great. And another question was just in terms of the working groups themselves and their makeup. Were local community people participating on some of those?
In the working groups?
Yeah.
Yes, I think so. I'm honestly not 100% sure about who makes up all of the working groups, but there is a list of participants on the Maine Climate Council's website that you can go look at. And I know that when they were putting together the groups, the working groups, they were very thoughtful about making sure that there was representation from across a wide range of industries and viewpoints in those working groups. David, do you have something to say about that?
Well, let's see. I can't remember if you said this number already, Sarah, but there were, what's the total number of people on the working groups? Way over 200, right? So a lot of people from around the state were involved, but I think it's safe to say that their voices weren't represented. Hard to pull that off, and so there's still plenty of work to be done. Another thing in terms of how communities are responding, or different people in Maine are responding. There were plans in the spring into the summer to have lots of public meetings all over the state by the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. You guys probably heard there was a pandemic, so not so easy. And yet they created a special website and tried to get as much feedback as they could via that method and others. I don't think I've yet seen I'm sure that I understand there were thousands of responses to that, but I haven't yet had a chance to look at those and digest them. So that's probably another piece of the puzzle here.
And one of the things, just to add to what David just said, I mean, what's one of the things that we all know about Maine? We don't have equal access to the internet. We don't have equal access to being able to, once COVID's there, being able to be engaged in these important issues, getting our stories out. One of the questions asked, has anybody started doing the work to do actual interviews? Well, we need to think as a state, of course it's important now that we live in kind of an internet world, it becomes even more important. How do we make sure that that's equitable? So we're hearing from everybody. We're getting people's voices. We're getting people's arguments about things and how this is affecting them. Maine is a tourism state, and lots of people depend for their livelihood on tourism. Tourism is going to change. How do we get those voices? How do we learn together? How do we bring together all of our different lived experiences and expertise so that we can really be thinking about these kinds of issues? Another question, another point is, so far it seems like an elitist group of credentialed and academic folk have asked a very similar group to tell how equitable they have been after the fact. We're thinking about that.
Good point.
I hope everybody's thinking about that.
And I think that I hope that one of the main takeaways from our report is that this is the beginning of Maine's effort to create climate justice. And I really hope that comes through in our report, because I think I speak for myself and Linda and David when I say that we really feel very strongly that creating relationships with frontline communities and uplifting community organizations and leaders within those communities and empowering communities to speak for themselves and to elevate their voices so that they can be heard by the governor's office, by the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. That's what's important. So yeah, again, I really hope that for Maine, what we are doing right now is the very, very beginning of a really long process of including those voices.
And looking at what isn't working quite well so far, and how we can argue with each other about it and say, okay, here's where we are now, and we're going to get better and better. We're going to be a state that doesn't say we all have to agree, but boy, we are going to be impacted as a state, but we can be a model for how we dealing with this, this important issue. I mean, it just is just key. And from the questions that are here, from things we're hearing from lots of different people, there are real opportunities for us to work together, to work with schools, to talk with youth that are in high school or in middle school, how they're thinking about things, how their teachers are thinking about things, to talk to people who are working on the roads. How do they think about things? I'm a part of an interesting group of of people who are looking at how roads and bridges are being affected by climate change. I didn't know. I'm ignorant about roads and bridges, but it turns out that asphalt responds in odd ways to changing temperature conditions. How do we think about those things and be prepared for those things? But we've got to bring our knowledge together.
Yeah, I think that actually Joyce Gibson in the chat synthesized that point really well and said, now we have the opportunity to organize frontline communities to get their reactions to the climate report. And we can work with students and community leaders to push the report to the next level, which I think is right on point. This is an opportunity to, and this is also the, part of the reason why giving this talk is so exciting is because we've just shared, I know that a lot of you who are all here today have the experience, have the ability to go out into communities and lift up these voices and help people share what is it that they want from Maine's climate action plan. So yeah, this is.
And Paloma Hunt says, in England, they're doing something very interesting where they work with citizen climate councils as mini publics and go through a deliberative process after listening to expert testimony. So how do we bring all this together? How do we bring people in Maine so that people are having fun talking together about this? I mean, could we create some interesting, for the Maine Science Festival that's all over the state, if we think about next year, could we do something that really focuses on how we get, all these voices are heard? Some of you who know me know I talk about my grandfather who was an Iowa farmer and how annoyed he was at experts who would come in and tell him how he should farm. But he also realized that it was really important to have conversations together. So how do we be like my granddad Orville and pay attention and find ways to talk together?
Linda, Karen Miller in the chat says we need to find out how these communities talk about, view justice, energy, and climate change. And I was wondering if you could share your anecdote about, I don't want to give it away, but the amazing thing you did in Lowell with the river.
Yeah, so sure, no, great. So one of the things that, if you know Lowell, Massachusetts, and many of you may know it, Lowell is a city that was dying because all the mills, basically all the companies had emptied out. And now it's a lively, but very polluted city. And it's lively because over half of the youth in the city are from refugee and immigrant backgrounds. So the population has dramatically changed. And people came to Lowell that in part they wanted to fish the river. They wanted to do things outside, Cambodian and Laotian families. And EPA basically came to us. I was directing a Center for Family Work and Community there at the university, and they said, you tell those people they shouldn't be fishing, they shouldn't be eating those fish, and they shouldn't be doing those, it's a dirty river. And instead of doing that, what we as a group began to do is say, tell us your stories about fishing. Tell us your stories about what you did at home. Tell us about what you're doing in your new home in terms of fishing and the importance of fish in your life and cleaning up a river. And this all led to a Southeast Asian water festival that recreates on the Merrimack what happens on the Mekong. And it's now, I think maybe in its 20th year. It celebrates community, it celebrates stories, and it celebrates the need to clean up the river and to all work together to do that. And is it easy to do? Do people all get along? No, 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 no. Do they get along better after the end of it? Yes, yes. The very first time the police shut down after it had been going on for a number of hours, the festival, they shut it down because they thought there was going to be some kind of gang violence because there were so many Southeast Asian youth around. we learned from that. We learned that we need to do things differently. We need to involve the police, working with all the youth who are working on the festival to do things that will make a difference. And now it is just, it's owned by the community's making a difference, the river is getting cleaned up. That's a very long story, but how did that happen? Part of what's so exciting is it happened because people came together. And that's what we can do in Maine and what we're good at doing. We don't have to all agree with each other, but boy, we can make a difference. So I know we've more or less run out of time, and I want to just say a couple things, and maybe Sara and David also, but what we learned from doing this is there's so much that we personally don't know about this very important issue. And it's only through working together that we're able to look at it and think about it. And that with a great team, that can happen.
If I could just pick up on some things that have been said here about youth, young people. Joyce Gibson said it. Linda, you were talking about it in Lowell. So there were really important young leaders as part of the Climate Council. I saw that Anya Wright, I think, was on this earlier. I'm not sure she's on now, but she and many other people played really important roles. I've just exchanged emails with Amara Ifeji, who was on the Climate and Equity Advisory Committee. She'll be speaking as part of the Mitchell Center series next semester, so you can come back. And I think one of the things that I take great hope from is the passion and the dedication of the young people who are taking this so seriously. As a scientist, I try to avoid making predictions because I'm usually wrong. But in this case, I'm going to go out on a limb and tell you that I predict, as one of those young people, Sara Kelemen will be on this for the rest of her life. And that's a very good thing.
And John Mattis asks, has the Wabanaki community been involved? And that's very important. And yes.
You bet.
Sara, do you have any final? Oh, thanks for putting that in of the members of the advisory group. Thank you. Sara, any last words? I asked you earlier when we were practicing, how has this changed you? Do you have any thoughts to add?
Well, just that it's only made me more passionate about this, and I would say also more thoughtful too. I realized that certainly we don't have all of the answers, and a lot of the answers lie with people who don't have a voice right now politically, and so changing that is, I think, the goal. And also, I would say if anyone has any follow-up questions, I know I'm definitely willing to answer them by email. Yeah. So shoot me an email.
Me too. Thank you for being here today and listening and helping us learn from you. And so we would love to hear from you.